The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 15th chapter. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." And so he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he's found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I found my sheep that was lost." Just so I tell you, there'll be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she's found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I found the coin that I had lost." Just so I tell you, there's joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. One dark winter night in Ohio a few years ago, I lost my church keys. In fact, I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was early in the evening, and I had just finished my workout at the fitness center where I belong, and had just put my gym bag into the trunk of the car when I tapped the outside of my pants pocket, which I do obsessively out of habit, I guess still do, in fact. You see, this is where I always kept my 2 sets of keys, still do, in fact. One key ring for my car and home keys, the other for the church and office keys. And I suddenly realized that I couldn't find the key ring with my church keys on it. Well, naturally, I paused and actually reached into the pocket to make sure. Nothing. Then I methodically checked my coat pockets as well. Still nothing. So I slowly walked around the car thinking that maybe I had dropped them while taking out my car keys. Nothing. Of course, by now I was beginning to worry a little bit. And so next I retraced my steps across the parking lot, back into the gym, then all the way back to the locker room, even making sure I hadn't dropped them somewhere along the way. But despite all these efforts, the key ring with my church keys on it was still nowhere to be found. And so now I began to panic. When I returned home, I even walked up and down the driveway several times, in fact, in case they had somehow fallen out earlier before leaving for the gym. That had happened once before, actually. Once while reaching into my pants pocket for the car keys, the 2 rings had become entangled, and the church keys had fallen out onto the driveway. But in that instance, at least, I had immediately heard the telltale clinking sound when they hit the pavement. But in this case, I didn't recall hearing anything in the driveway at home, nor in the parking lot outside the gym, for that matter. At this point, I even wondered if maybe they had fallen into the snow, either by the front porch while I was leaving the house, or by the side of the driveway while I was getting into the car. It was too dark at this point, however, so I broke off my search for the night. But bright and early the next morning, I was back out there with a snow shovel, frantically checking once again to make sure, because if they had fallen into the snow, that certainly would have explained why I hadn't heard any sound. Still no luck, though. Then later that day, I returned to the gym to check to see if anyone had found them and turned them in at the front desk. I even walked over to the grocery store located next door to the gym, did the same at their customer service counter. But I struck out in those 2 places as well. And I was really frustrated and angry now, mad at myself mostly because losing things is just not like me. Now, Jeanette. Well, I'm always accusing her of losing her keys, which is actually really unfair. I have to say that. She's sitting there. Because she never really loses them. She just technically misplaces them momentarily. And so it was at this point, after I exhausted all of my options, that I finally gave up and admitted defeat. The keys were either long gone, or if they had indeed fallen into the snow, I was never going to find them again until spring. And to her credit, Jeanette, who I'm always giving such a hard time for misplacing her keys, didn't say a thing. She didn't have to. She just laughed. It was like she was saying, how do you like it now, big fella, that the shoe's on the other foot? Needless to say, searching for something that has been lost, of course, is also the theme of our gospel reading this morning. As we heard, Jesus told a couple of short parables. One about a lost sheep, the other about a lost coin. And just as I searched all over the gym, the parking lot, our driveway back home, even out in the snow, both the shepherd and the woman in Jesus' parables diligently searched for what they too had lost. And so what's the point? Well, to understand these parables and why Jesus even told them in the first place, we have to look no further than the first two verses of our reading. The setting, Luke tells us, is simply one of those times when tax collectors and sinners were flocking to hear Jesus teach. There was something in his message, apparently, that spoke to and resonated with them. And in a nutshell, it was acceptance. These tax collectors and sinners, you see, were the outcasts of proper Jewish society. They were not the kind of people you associated with or, heaven forbid, invited to your home. And as such, when they weren't simply being ignored, they were also being looked down upon by all the so-called respectable people of that day, especially the religious ones. And that really is made perfectly clear in the very next verse when we hear these religious people, the Pharisees and the scribes, grumbling amongst themselves, saying, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. To them, this kind of association, this kind of close association that Jesus was openly initiating and demonstrating was inconceivable, if not unconscionable. To them, tax collectors and sinners were not God's kind of people. As Scott Hosey writes, tax collectors and sinners in the eyes of the Pharisees and scribes were lost to God. The religious establishment, says Hosey, viewed these other people as being quite literally lost causes. So much so, in fact, that it seems to have never even occurred to these Pharisees and scribes to reach out to such sinners, as Jesus himself was doing. In other words, lost was lost, and found was found. It was one or the other. And so why in the world would Jesus seek out and waste his time on those who were already lost? That, it seems, was the logic of these Pharisees and scribes. And Jesus' answer to that question, that faulty logic, is what we hear next. Which of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one who is lost until he finds it? Recently, I read that Macaulay Culkin had just turned 39 years old back on August 26. He's probably best known, of course, for his starring role in the hit movie Home Alone. Again, many of you probably remember. In fact, it's still the highest grossing live-action comedy of all time. And in the 1990 film, Culkin played 8-year-old Kevin McAllister, who was a bit of an outcast himself, even in his own family. It's the night before they're going to leave for a holiday trip to Paris, France, and Kevin first finds himself as the subject of some ridicule, both from his siblings and also his cousins. You see, Kevin's uncle and his family were also going to be making the trip with them. And then after getting into an argument with his older brother Buzz, because Buzz ate Kevin's piece of pizza on purpose, Kevin is banished to his third-floor bedroom all by himself, wishing that his family would simply disappear. The house is so full of people, he says, it makes me sick. When I grow up and get married, I'm living alone. Well, lo and behold, he gets his wish. You see, the next morning, the family accidentally leaves Kevin asleep in bed after a power outage overnight caused them to oversleep, which threatens then to make them late for their flight. A neighbor boy outside is then mistaken for Kevin in the head count, and the extended family, all 14 of them, hurriedly departs for Chicago's O'Hare Airport, but without Kevin, of course. And once settled on the plane, however, with all 14 McAllisters scattered throughout the cabin, Kevin's mom, Kate McAllister, played by Catherine O'Hara, has this nagging feeling that they've forgotten something. So she turns to her husband and she asks, did I turn off the coffee? No, I did, he says. Did you lock up? Yeah. Did we set the timers on the lights? Yeah. Did you close the garage? That's it. I forgot to close the garage, she says. That's it. And she sits back in her seat. And after a pause, no, that's not it, he says. Well, what else could we be forgetting, she asks. And both of them now sit back in their seats, and after an even longer pause, she suddenly pops back upright and screams, "Kevin!" And so, as the film's title indicates, Kevin has been left home alone. His mother says to the father, "How could we do this? We didn't forget him," says the dad, "we just miscounted. What kind of mother am I?" she laments. To which he replies, "If it makes you feel any better, I forgot my reading classes too." And from this point on in the movie, there are two parallel storylines, if you will. Now, the one that most of us probably remember best is how Kevin manages to fend for himself, left all alone there at home, especially when he has to tangle with a couple of would-be house robbers, played by Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern. But the other storyline is the one that I actually want to call to your attention and focus on this morning. It's what happens when the McAllister family finally lands in France. Kevin's mom is simply beside herself, not only overwhelmed by the guilt of leaving without him, but also by her mother's protective instincts and her very natural fear for his safety and well-being. After all, he's just a little boy. So immediately, she tries to book a return flight to Chicago, but she soon discovers that it's not so easy. However, she does manage to fly to Dallas, Texas, and then from Dallas to Scranton, Pennsylvania, of all places, where my family, as I've mentioned before, comes from. But here in Scranton, she apparently runs out of luck. The flight to Chicago has been canceled, and Kevin's mom now starts to lose it with the ticket agent. "I've been awake here for almost 60 hours, she says. I'm tired, I'm dirty. I've been from Chicago to Paris to Dallas to where am I?" The ticket agent replies, "Scranton." And Kate finally turns loose all of her pent-up emotions and aggravation. "I'm trying to get home to my 8-year-old son, and now that I'm this close, you're telling me it's hopeless?" This is Christmas, she says, the season of perpetual hope. And I don't care if I have to go out on your runway and hitchhike. If it costs me everything I own, if I have to sell my soul to the devil himself, I'm going to get home to my son. Now, certainly this sense, not to mention this scene, not to mention the entire premise of the movie, is highly exaggerated and unrealistic, but even so, it does contain more than a kernel of truth. For what mother or father wouldn't do anything, give anything, sacrifice anything, or pay anything to find their lost child and to be reunited with him? And that, says Jesus, is exactly how God feels about, acts towards, and treats those who are lost as well. In Home Alone, as you may recall, Captain O'Hara's character manages to make a connection with Gus Polinski, played by the late comedian John Candy, and his polka band, the Kenosha Kickers, who are driving home to Wisconsin in a rented truck after their own flight was canceled. And by the film's end, she eventually arrives home after a long, arduous drive with that polka band. And ironically, it's literally just moments before the rest of the family gets there, because they were able to catch a later direct flight and actually make it all the way back to Chicago. And so now the McAllister clan is finally and happily reunited, even having learned a few important lessons in the process. Well, it's not much different in Jesus' story, is it? Just as Kate McAllister immediately left her husband and children behind in Paris without even a second thought in order to return home looking for her lost son, Kevin, the shepherd in Jesus' parable doesn't hesitate either, leaving the 99 sheep all by themselves in the wilderness in order to go searching for the one that had been lost. And when he finds it, he rejoices and carries it back home on his shoulders. And likewise, the woman who's lost her silver coin literally tears the house apart looking for it. And when she finally finds it, she then calls all of her friends and neighbors together to celebrate. And so it is with God, says Jesus. Instead of thinking like the Pharisees and scribes that lost is lost and found is found, and why in the world would anyone concern themselves with those who are lost? God looks at those who are lost, anyone who is lost, as someone worth looking for and then finding, which is precisely why God sent Jesus into the world. Jesus, it's been said, is on a search and rescue mission. In fact, in many ways, Luke 15 and its three powerful stories of being lost and then found again, the lost sheep, the lost coin, not to mention the lost son, which comprises the remainder of the chapter, contains perhaps the central message of the entire Bible. That God not only loves us for who we are, but also that God is willing to go to any length in order to seek and to find and then to bring us back home. As William Willimon once wrote, when we're telling the story of us and God, we've got to talk about the God that came for us in Jesus Christ, the one who doesn't leave it all up to us. It's not over between us and God until God says it's over. No, God is the one who seeks and searches and finds. And yet we usually think of it as being the other way around, don't we? In other words, that we somehow seek out, search for, and ultimately find God ourselves. In fact, many Christians actually hold and encourage that view, and on the face of it, it certainly seems like a positive, even reassuring message. But in light of today's gospel reading, I have to tell you that it's also false, completely, utterly false. You see, the real problem here is not simply that we need to turn back to God. No, the real problem, is that we're completely incapable of doing so. That's the sad but unavoidable truth. We are absolutely incapable of turning back to God on our own or through our own efforts. If we were capable, if it were possible, then there would have been no need for Jesus Christ in the first place. Absolutely no need for God to come to this crazy, mixed-up world in search of the lost. The problem with that line of reasoning is the very same problem the Pharisees and the scribes had. They too thought that our relationship with God depended on keeping the rules, and in so doing, being able then to honor God. They too apparently believed that it was possible to restore honor, as I say, to do the right thing. In other words, to somehow find themselves. But the Bible reminds us over and over again of exactly the opposite. Instead of us finding God, the consistent message throughout all of Scripture is that God always finds us. Go back to the very beginning, to Adam and Eve in the garden. What do we see? Genesis 3 tells us how that first man and woman disobeyed and rebelled against God. Their eyes were opened. They realized what they had done. They knew it was wrong. Now, if it was possible for them to somehow find God, then surely that's what Adam and Eve would have done themselves, don't you think? Instead, says Genesis 3, what did they do? They heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden, and the man and the wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God. In other words, they didn't look for God or seek him out or try to return to him. Rather, they, in their fear and shame, avoided him. And it was God then who went looking for them, the God who called out to the man, "Where are you?" And unfortunately, that tragic moment has then been replayed countless times ever since, and by every human being to ever walk on this planet as well. For it's our sinfulness that separates us from God and causes us to hide from him in fear of being punished. And it's God who nevertheless still loves us despite our sin, and who comes looking for us, who searches relentlessly for us until we're finally found, who is willing to go to any length, spare no expense, even the life of his dear Son, in order to seek out, to find, to restore those who were lost in their sin. In effect, God says to us, my love is greater than your sin. That's the gospel message. That's also the mission of the church then as well. As someone once said, the church is the great lost and found department. Or as Philip Blackwell once noted, the church is not a club for the found, but a haven for the lost. It does not exist to salve the saved, but to save the sinner. It's not meant to serve its members, but to bind up the broken down, to quench the thirst of the parched, to befriend the friendless, to free the oppressed. And the only way that we can find ourselves in such community, he says, is when we see ourselves as the lost sheep, not among the 39 righteous ones. And therein lies the final irony. You see, when Jesus was talking about finding lost sheep and lost coins, even lost sons, he didn't just mean tax collectors and sinners and other such undesirables. He didn't just mean them, whoever we might think them to be. No, he meant us, all of us. Everyone who's ever made a mistake or done something wrong, the church and the unchurched, citizen and illegal alien alike, Pharisee and scribe, tax collector and sinner, Democrats and Republicans, those who listen to Fox News, those who listen to MSNBC, all of us, we're all lost, anxiously waiting, needing to be found. And that's precisely what Jesus Christ came to do. Moreover, once found doesn't necessarily mean always found either, even for Kevin McAllister. Because in Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, the 1992 sequel to Home Alone, you may recall that the McAllisters were once again headed off on a Christmas trip, Only this time, Kevin mistakenly follows a man wearing this very same coat as his father, and then boards the wrong plane by accident. And so while the rest of the family flies on to Florida, Kevin finds himself landing in New York City instead. And so when Kevin turns up missing again, a police officer asks his parents if this has ever happened before. And Kate, once again played by Catherine O'Hara, answers, "As a matter of fact, this has happened before. It's become sort of a McAllister family tradition." To which her husband adds, funnily though, we never seem to lose our luggage." It's sad to say, but getting lost from God has become sort of a human family tradition as well. We're forever getting lost. But the good news is that we can indeed be found again. At the end of Home Alone 2, Kevin is staring at the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. "I know that I don't deserve a Christmas," he says, "even if I did a good deed. I don't want any presents. I want to take back every mean thing I ever said to my family, even if they don't take back the things they said to me. I don't care. I love all of them, including Buzz. I know it isn't possible to see them all. Could I just see my mother? I'll never want another thing as long as I live if I can just see my mother. I know I won't see her tonight, but promise me that I can see her again sometime, anytime, even if it's just one and only for a couple of minutes, once and only for a couple of minutes. I just need to tell her I'm sorry." And just then his mother calls out, "Kevin?" And he says, "Mom." And he looks at the tree and he says, "Wow, that works fast." But God works pretty fast too. Are you feeling lost this morning? Abandoned, trapped, anxious, overwhelmed, underappreciated? Well, just know this. Whatever you've done or think you've done, whatever has happened to you or not happened to you, God is right there beside you, just waiting for you to turn and to see him, just waiting for you to realize that he's been there all along, just waiting to hear us say, "I'm sorry." Left to our own devices, you see, we're all home alone and hopelessly lost. But we certainly don't have to stay that way, because God has been searching for us always and forever. And in Jesus Christ, he's found us. Oh, and by the way, my church keys, I hate to admit it, especially after the way I always get on her case so bad when she misplaces something. But Jeanette finally found them for me the following summer while cleaning out, of all places, the trunk of the car. I guess I looked everywhere but there. Amen. Please stand for the hymn of the day.